From Doctor Who to Rick and Morty to Star Trek to The Twilight Zone and many, many others, we have lots of stories about time standing still. But does that idea actually make sense? And what would it be like if it did? Part 1. Changes! There seems to be an intimate connection between time and change. One way that philosophers think about change is to say that objects have properties and then they have different properties. And that use of the word then means that we must be talking about time here. In most of the fictional stories where time stands still, the protagonists notice because everything around them is frozen, i.e. not changing. In fact, it's tempting to just wrap this question up here and say that time is change, and a cursory look at physics might support that idea. The smallest interval of time that we can measure is the time it takes for a photon of light, which is the fastest thing in the universe, to travel across the smallest measurable distance, which we call a Planck length. In school, you probably learned the equation speed is distance over time, which if we rearrange it gives us time is distance divided by speed. 1 Planck length is roughly 1.6 times 10 to the minus 35 meters, which is way, way smaller even than a proton. A Planck time is the time it takes a photon to travel that far, which is very fast, 5.39 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds. That's 0, then 43 more zeros, 539. The smallest measurement of time that makes sense. And interestingly for us, that smallest interval of time is a measurement of change, the change in position of a photon. If time were to stop, then photons couldn't be moving, which means you wouldn't be able to see anything because no photons would be entering your eyes. And everything would be very, very cold because no molecules would be vibrating, and molecules vibrating is what heat is. You also wouldn't be able to breathe or move because the air around you can't move. And you also wouldn't know this was happening because your brain would be frozen as well. If you were just moving really, really fast, faster than everything else like the Flash, then you would perceive that as everything else moving more slowly, which would be kind of like time almost stopping. But if all the molecules around you were slower than you, that would mean you were much hotter than them, because temperature is just mean kinetic energy. Even assuming that that temperature differential didn't kill you, your own heat would leak into your surroundings, causing them to begin speeding up anyway. But from physics to physics, the physics, Aristotle's book, Physics. In it, the famous Greek philosopher notes the connection between time and change, but he doesn't think they're the same thing. Because change, he says, only happens in the thing that changes, whereas time is everywhere. Change can occur faster or slower, and faster and slower are measurements in time, not of time. So Aristotle thinks that time is what we measure change in, just like space is what we measure size in. But, well, sorry Aristotle, but does change only happen in the thing that changes? Surely change is just as much in the relation between the thing that changes and everything else. Doesn't everything change relative to something, even if it's just the other parts of itself? And even more seriously, is change something that occurs within the passage of time? I want to float a contrary idea here and say that it doesn't make sense to talk about time stopping, because time was never moving to begin with. Part 2. You are here. We're going to have to make a quick detour here and talk about the universe. All of it. Philosophers of time distinguish between A universes and B universes, and we're going to need to understand this distinction. An A universe is more or less how we've been imagining it so far. Time passes in an A universe. There is a definite past, present, and future, and time flows like a river from one into the other. In a B universe, time doesn't pass, and it's less like a river, more like a swimming pool. The best way to explain it is with an analogy to space and the word here. So, I am here in my bedroom, and you are there, wherever you are, but there is no property of here-ness. We could do endless scientific tests in both locations, but we wouldn't find any particles or anything that would explain why this place is here and your location is there. And that's because the word here is what philosophers call an indexical, a word whose meaning changes depending on who uses it. For me, my bedroom is here and your location is there, but for you, it's the other way around. And that's not a contradiction, because that's just how the words work. So in a B universe where time doesn't pass, the present is like the word here, an indexical, and past and future are like the word there. The present just refers to the bit of time where we are, but in fact, all times exist equally. Earlier on, we said that one way of thinking about change is to say that objects have properties and then they have different properties. And some philosophers, notably John McTaggart, who invented the distinction between A series and B series, say that if you're a B theorist, you can't explain change. The B theorist account of change is to say that objects have temporal parts. So imagine that there's a hot pie that's cooling down. There is an earlier bit of the pie which is hot, and a later bit of the pie which is cool, but the B theorist says the pie as a whole is an object that exists across time, a 4D object. To us, it looks as if the pie is changing, but that's just because we're looking at a different part of it. And McTaggart doesn't buy this. He says that's not a description of change, any more than you could say that the text of a book changes as you read it. It doesn't, you're just looking at a different bit of it. And McTaggart wasn't the only philosopher to say that we need time to pass for human ideas to make sense. A.N. Pryor talked about the sentence, "Thank goodness that's over." If I go to the dentist and I have a really painful surgery and I say, "Thank goodness that's over," Pryor says, that sentence doesn't make sense in a B universe, because it's not really over. It's just located at a different time. Part 3. Time Bandits. So, we've got McTaggart saying that the idea of change wouldn't make sense unless time passed. And we've got Pryor saying that the idea of relief wouldn't make sense unless time passed. But a philosopher called Simon Prosser, who incidentally was my metaphysics teacher, has pointed out that the universe isn't necessarily bound to make sense to human beings. The key to Prosser's argument is something we've touched on Philosophy Tube many times before, so you should be able to roll with it pretty easily. You can say the same thing twice and have very different results depending on how you say it. The example I like to use is the sentence, "I love you." Whenever I say it, assuming I'm telling the truth, the meaning is the same. I, the person speaking, have some feelings of love towards you, the person to whom I am speaking. But depending on the way in which I say it, you might receive the message very differently. I could say, "I love you" as a reminder. I could say it as comfort. I could say it as pleading. If I send you a text message that says "I love you" every 2 minutes for a week, you might start to get a little bit unnerved by it. The meaning is the same, but the affect it has can change. And the same is true for sentences about time. Prosser argues that the sentence, "Thank goodness that's over," quite right, doesn't have the same affect as the sentence, "Thank goodness that experience is located at a time prior to the indexically defined present," which is how the B theorist would technically rephrase it, but that doesn't mean that they aren't actually saying the same thing. Ditto for sentences about change. Just because talking about temporal parts feels a little bit different than talking about past, present, and future, doesn't mean that B theory is bogus. In which case, it wouldn't make sense to talk about time stopping, because time was never moving to begin with. So, you might want to throw out your watch, because it might only be as useful as a piece of paper that says, "You are here." Patreon.com/philosophytube is how I keep making this show and affording food. If you could give me a couple of dollars a month, it goes towards making education free. And don't forget to subscribe.